From a white character transformed to save a studio from bankruptcy to Isaac Hayes' Oscar-winning theme, nearly being disqualified, the making of this groundbreaking blaxploitation classic is filled with surprising secrets that are far stranger than fiction itself. Fact 1. John Shaft was white in the original script. One of the most shocking secrets behind Shaft is that the iconic black private detective almost never existed at all. When screenwriter Ernest Tidyman first adapted his own novel for the big screen, he completely changed the race of his main character, writing John Shaft as a white man despite the fact that the character had been black in his original 1970 book. This dramatic shift wasn't some creative decision or studio mandate, it was simply what Tidyman thought would work better for Hollywood at the time. The white author, who had created the character as an African-American detective in his novel, apparently believed that a white leading man would have a better chance of success in the film industry of 1971. This was during an era when black actors were rarely given leading roles in major studio productions, especially in action films. Everything changed when legendary photographer and filmmaker Gordon Parks came aboard to direct the project. Parks, who was already making history as one of the first black directors to helm a major studio film, took one look at Tidyman's screenplay and immediately recognized what needed to be done. He insisted that the character return to his original conception as a black man and pushed hard for the casting of Richard Roundtree, a relatively unknown model and actor at the time. Parks' decision to restore Shaft's racial identity wasn't just about staying true to the source material, it was about representation and giving black audiences a hero they could see themselves in. The director understood that this film had the potential to break new ground and create something that had never really existed before in mainstream cinema. A confident, capable black action hero who didn't apologize for who he was. This single casting decision ended up changing the entire trajectory of the film and launched what would become known as the blaxploitation genre. Fact 2. The film literally saved MGM from bankruptcy. By 1971, the legendary Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer studio was in serious financial trouble and teetering on the edge of complete collapse. The once mighty entertainment giant that had produced classics like The Wizard of Oz and Singin' in the Rain was now struggling to stay afloat in a rapidly changing Hollywood landscape, and studio executives were desperately looking for any project that might turn their fortunes around. That year, MGM released only a handful of films, and most of them were commercial disasters that lost money rather than making it. In fact, out of all the movies the studio put out in 1971, only 3 managed to turn a profit at the box office. One of those 3 was a relatively small-budget action film about a black private detective that many industry insiders thought was a risky gamble. Shaft had been made for the modest sum of $1.2 million, which was considered a low-budget production by studio standards of the time. Nobody at MGM expected it to become a major hit, and some executives were probably just hoping it would break even and not lose them any more money. Instead, the film became a surprise blockbuster that earned an incredible $10.8 million in its first year of release alone, with $7 million of that coming from domestic box office sales. This massive return on investment was exactly what MGM needed to keep the lights on and continue operating as a major studio. The success of Shaft provided the financial breathing room that allowed the company to survive its crisis period and eventually recover. Industry observers later credited the film with literally saving MGM from bankruptcy, making it one of the most important movies in the studio's long history for reasons that had nothing to do with artistic merit. Fact 3. Isaac Hayes almost didn't get the Oscar. Isaac Hayes' funky, soul-stirring theme song for Shaft became one of the most iconic pieces of film music ever created, but the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences nearly prevented him from receiving the Oscar he deserved because of an outdated and narrow-minded rule about musical composition. The controversy began when Academy officials discovered that Hayes couldn't read or write traditional music notation, which they initially claimed disqualified him from being considered the true composer of the song. This bureaucratic nightmare stemmed from the Academy's rigid definition of what constituted legitimate musical authorship during the early 1970s. At that time, many Academy members believed that only composers who could physically write down musical notes on paper should be eligible for songwriting awards, completely ignoring the rich tradition of musicians who created music through other methods like improvisation, oral tradition, or collaborative studio work. Hayes had composed the entire theme from Shaft using his ears, his voice, and his natural musical instincts, working with session musicians to bring his vision to life in the recording studio. He would hum melodies, sing vocal parts, and direct the arrangement without ever putting pen to paper in the traditional sense. To the Academy's old-fashioned way of thinking, this somehow made his creative contribution less valid or authentic. Fortunately, legendary music producer and composer Quincy Jones stepped in to defend Hayes and fight the Academy's decision. Jones argued passionately that the musical ideas, the creative vision, and the artistic direction all came directly from Hayes' mind and talent, regardless of whether he could write it down using conventional notation. Jones pointed out that many great musicians throughout history had created masterpieces without formal training in music theory or notation, and that Hayes' method of composition was just as legitimate as any other approach. Thanks to Jones's intervention and advocacy, the Academy eventually reversed their decision and allowed Hayes to remain eligible. Fact 4. Hayes auditioned for Shaft, but got the soundtrack instead. Isaac Hayes walked into the casting room for Shaft with dreams of becoming the next big action star, but he left with something even better that would change his career forever. The soul musician and composer had heard about this new film featuring a tough black private detective and thought it sounded like the perfect opportunity to break into acting, so he showed up to audition for the title role of John Shaft alongside hundreds of other hopeful actors. At the time, Hayes was already an established figure in the music world, having made a name for himself as a songwriter and performer with Stax Records in Memphis. He had co-written hits like Soul Man and Hold On, I'm Comin', and released his own successful albums, but acting represented a completely new challenge that excited him. Like many musicians of that era, Hayes was interested in expanding his artistic horizons and saw Hollywood as the next logical step in his creative journey. During his audition, Hayes clearly didn't impress the casting directors enough to land the lead role, which ultimately went to Richard Roundtree. However, the producers were so struck by Hayes' musical background and his deep understanding of the character's world that they approached him with a different proposition entirely. Instead of playing Shaft on screen, they asked if he would be interested in creating the musical score that would help define the character's attitude and environment. According to Hayes himself, producer Joel Freeman had actually promised him an audition for the lead role as part of the deal, to get him to compose the music, but that audition never materialized. Hayes kept his end of the bargain anyway, and went ahead with creating what would become one of the most influential film soundtracks in cinema history. This twist of fate turned out to be incredibly fortunate, as Hayes' musical contribution to Shaft became far more iconic and lasting than any acting performance could have been. Fact 5. The British reporter who didn't know what Shaft meant. When Gordon Parks flew to London to promote his groundbreaking film, he encountered one of the most awkward and amusing moments of the entire publicity tour during a press screening with British journalists. The cultural differences between American and British slang created a situation that was both embarrassing and hilarious, leaving Parks to give what he later described as the most honest answer he could provide. During the question-and-answer session following the screening, a genuinely confused British reporter raised his hand and asked Parks to explain what the word shaft actually meant in American terms. The reporter seemed completely unaware of the slang meaning of the title and was apparently looking for a straightforward definition that would help British audiences understand the film better. This innocent question caught Parks completely off guard and put him in the uncomfortable position of having to explain American street language to a room full of proper British journalists. Rather than launch into a lengthy explanation about American slang and its various meanings, Parks decided to take a more direct approach that would get his point across without having to say anything inappropriate out loud. He simply smiled at the reporter, raised his hand, and stuck his middle finger up in the air, telling the room that this gesture represented the most honest answer he could give to the question. The reporter wasn't satisfied with this visual explanation and pressed Parks for more details, following up by asking why the characters in the film kept calling each other mother throughout the movie. Parks found himself completely stumped by this second question and had no idea how to explain that particular piece of American vernacular to a British audience. Fortunately, a woman in the audience came to his rescue by suggesting that the reporter think about a popular jam brand, remove the first two letters, add an F, and he would get the message. Fact 6. Gordon Parks almost shot the film in Los Angeles. Just hours before Gordon Parks was scheduled to begin filming Shaft in New York City, he received devastating news from MGM executives that nearly destroyed his vision for the entire project. The studio had decided at the last minute that shooting the film in Manhattan would be too expensive and complicated, so they ordered Parks to pack up his equipment and crew and return to Los Angeles immediately to shoot the movie on studio lots and backlots instead. This sudden change of plans represented everything that Parks was fighting against in his approach to filmmaking, because he understood that the authentic atmosphere of New York City was absolutely essential to making Shaft work as both a character study and an action film. The gritty streets of Harlem, the bustling energy of Times Square, and the underground culture of Greenwich Village weren't just background elements that could be easily recreated on a Hollywood soundstage. They were integral parts of the story that helped define who John Shaft was and what his world looked like. Parks knew that filming in Los Angeles would result in a sanitized, artificial version of New York that would completely undermine the authenticity he was trying to achieve, so he made a decision that could have ended his career before it really began. He flew back to the West Coast and walked into a meeting with MGM studio heads, where he delivered an ultimatum that shocked everyone in the room. Parks told the executives that he would rather quit the project entirely than compromise his artistic vision by shooting a fake version of New York in California. In his autobiography, Parks recalled telling the studio bosses that the film has to have the smell of New York to be successful, and he was willing to walk away from his first major directing opportunity to protect that vision. The studio executives, perhaps recognizing that they had already invested too much in the project to start over with a new director, eventually backed down and allowed Parks to return to New York to shoot the film as originally planned. Fact 7. The real Bumpy Jonas inspired modern gangster movies. The intimidating crime boss that Moses Gunn portrayed in Shaft wasn't just a fictional character created for the movie Bumpy Jonas, was actually based on one of the most notorious and influential real-life gangsters in American history. Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson ruled the Harlem underworld from the 1930s through the 1960s, building a criminal empire that would inspire storytellers and filmmakers for decades to come. Johnson earned his nickname Bumpy because of a large bump on the back of his head, but there was nothing comical about his reputation on the streets of New York. He controlled much of the illegal gambling, drug trafficking, and other criminal activities in Harlem during his peak years, and he was known for being both ruthlessly violent and surprisingly intelligent in his business dealings. Johnson had connections to some of the most powerful organized crime families in the country, and he played a major role in the infamous murder of Dutch Schultz, one of the most feared gangsters of the Prohibition era. What made Johnson particularly fascinating was his role as a mentor to other criminals who would later become legendary figures themselves. He took a young Frank Lucas under his wing and taught him the drug trade, and Lucas would eventually become the subject of the 2007 film American Gangster, where Clarence Williams III portrayed Johnson. Johnson's life story proved so compelling that Hollywood kept returning to it again and again, with Lawrence Fishburne playing him in the 1997 film Hoodlum and Forrest Whitaker taking on the role in the 2019 television series Godfather of Harlem. The character of Bumpy Jonas in Shaft represented just the beginning of Johnson's influence on popular culture, as his real-life story continued to fascinate audiences and inspire new projects long after his death in 1968. Proving that truth really can be stranger and more interesting than fiction. Fact 8. Muhammad Ali's trainer had a key role. One of the most colorful supporting characters in Shaft was played by a man who was already famous in boxing circles long before he ever stepped in front of a movie camera. Drew Bundini Brown, who portrayed Willie in the film, was Muhammad Ali's beloved assistant trainer and one of the most important figures in the heavyweight champion's inner circle during the peak years of his career. Brown wasn't just any ordinary member of Ali's training team, he was the creative genius behind some of the most memorable and poetic phrases that became synonymous with the greatest boxer of all time. Most famously, Brown was the person who came up with the iconic line, "Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee," which became Ali's signature motto and one of the most quoted sports phrases in history. Brown had a natural talent for creating catchy, rhythmic sayings that captured Ali's fighting style and personality, and he would often perform these phrases with Ali for television cameras and reporters. Beyond his role as a motivational poet and phrasemaker, Brown served as Ali's assistant trainer and was known for his passionate, almost spiritual approach to preparing fighters for big matches. He brought an intense energy and emotional connection to his work that went far beyond the technical aspects of boxing training, and Ali relied on him not just for physical preparation but for psychological and emotional support as well. In Shaft, Brown played Willie as a former childhood friend of the title character who had become involved with black militant groups and was disgusted with what he saw as Shaft's materialistic lifestyle. The role gave Brown a chance to show off his acting abilities and his natural charisma, qualities that had already made him a beloved figure in the boxing world. His presence in the film added an extra layer of authenticity and street credibility that helped establish the movie's connection to real African-American culture and communities. Fact 9. Gordon Parks made a secret cameo. director Gordon Parks couldn't resist the temptation to put himself in front of the camera for a brief moment during one of the most memorable sequences in his groundbreaking film. During the montage where John Shaft is searching through Harlem trying to track down the elusive Ben Buford, Parks appears on screen as a frustrated landlord who has his own bone to pick with the man Shaft is looking for. The cameo happens so quickly that most viewers miss it entirely on their first viewing, but Parks shows up as a pipe-smoking property owner who approaches Shaft during his investigation. When Shaft asks about Buford's whereabouts, Parks' character immediately launches into a complaint about how Buford owes him 6 months' worth of back rent and that he's been trying to find the guy just as desperately as Shaft has been. This small acting role gave Parks a chance to inject some humor into the film while also demonstrating his understanding of the everyday realities that people in Harlem were dealing with during that time period. The landlord character represents the kind of ordinary working person who gets caught up in the chaos and drama that surrounds more exciting figures like private detectives and criminals, and Parks played the role with just the right amount of exasperation and world-weary frustration. Parks was already well known for his work as a photographer and filmmaker, but this cameo showed that he also had some natural acting ability and wasn't afraid to step in front of the camera when the scene called for it. The appearance also reflects the hands-on, personal approach that Parks took to every aspect of making Shaft, treating the project not just as a job, but as a deeply personal artistic statement about Black life and culture in America. His willingness to appear in the film, even briefly, demonstrated his complete commitment to bringing this story to life in the most authentic way possible. Fact 10. Richard Roundtree beat 200 other actors. The competition to play John Shaft was absolutely fierce, with more than 200 actors showing up to audition for what everyone in Hollywood recognized as a potentially career-making role. Richard Roundtree walked into that massive casting call as a relatively unknown model and actor with very little film experience, competing against seasoned performers who had much more impressive resumes and established reputations in the entertainment industry. At the time of his audition, Roundtree had only appeared in one previous film, a small role in the 1970 comedy What Do You Say to a Naked Lady?, which was a hidden camera-style reality film directed by the creator of Candid Camera. His background was primarily in modeling and some stage work with the Negro Ensemble Company, where he had played the role of boxing legend Jack Johnson in their production of The Great White Hope. This limited acting experience put him at a significant disadvantage compared to many of the other actors who were vying for the same part. What Roundtree lacked in extensive acting credits, he made up for in natural charisma, physical presence, and an authentic understanding of the character that Gordon Parks was trying to bring to life. Parks later said that he spotted something special in Roundtree during the cattle call auditions, recognizing that the young actor possessed the perfect combination of toughness, intelligence, and sex appeal that the role demanded. The casting decision proved to be absolutely brilliant, as Roundtree's portrayal of Shaft not only launched his own career, but also established him as the first Black action hero in mainstream cinema history. His performance broke new ground by presenting a confident, capable Black leading man who didn't apologize for his strength or his sexuality, creating a template that would influence action heroes for decades to come, and fundamentally changing how Black masculinity was portrayed on the big screen. Fact 11. The soundtrack was recorded on primitive equipment. Isaac Hayes was a perfectionist when it came to his music, and he was never completely happy with the technical limitations he faced while creating the original recordings for the Shaft soundtrack. The initial sessions were done using a relatively primitive 3-track recording system that didn't give him the sonic depth and richness he was hearing in his head, leaving him frustrated with the quality of what would eventually become one of the most influential film soundtracks in movie history. Working with such basic equipment meant that Hayes couldn't capture all the subtle layers and intricate arrangements that he wanted to include in his compositions, and he felt like the music wasn't living up to its full potential. The 3-track system severely limited his ability to separate different instruments and vocal parts, forcing him to make compromises that he knew were holding back the overall impact of the songs. As someone who had already established himself as an innovative producer and arranger, Hayes understood exactly what the music could sound like if he had access to better recording technology. Rather than accepting these limitations and releasing a soundtrack that didn't meet his artistic standards, Hayes made a bold decision to take matters into his own hands. Without telling the film's producers or the record label what he was planning, he quietly returned to his home base at Stax Records in Memphis and secretly re-recorded the entire soundtrack using the superior equipment and facilities that were available there. The orchestral elements for the album were completed in just one day, and the vocals were finished the next day, but Hayes still wasn't satisfied with the results. He kept working and refining the recordings until he felt they properly represented his vision for how the music should sound. This dedication to quality and willingness to invest his own time and resources into perfecting the soundtrack helped ensure that the final product would stand the test of time. Fact 12. A glass window continuity error. Even the most carefully made films sometimes contain small mistakes that slip past the editors and crew members, and Shaft has one particularly noticeable continuity error that eagle-eyed viewers have been spotting for decades. The mistake occurs during the early scene where John Shaft confronts two of Bumpy Jonas's thugs who have been waiting for him in his Times Square office building, leading to a brief but intense fight that establishes Shaft's physical prowess and no-nonsense attitude. During this confrontation, Shaft forcefully pushes one of the goons through the door into his office, and audiences can clearly hear the unmistakable sound of glass shattering as the man crashes through the entrance. The audio suggests that the thug's impact has broken the glass panel that forms part of Shaft's office door, which would make perfect sense given the violence of the moment and the force with which Shaft shoves the man into the room. However, if you watch the scene carefully and pay attention to the visual details rather than just following the action, you'll notice something that doesn't quite match up with what your ears are telling you. Despite the loud sound of breaking glass that plays over the scene, the glass window in Shaft's office door remains completely intact and undamaged immediately after the collision, with no visible cracks, chips, or missing pieces that would indicate it had just been shattered. The continuity error becomes even more obvious as the scene continues, because the glass window eventually does appear broken in later shots, suggesting that the filmmakers shot multiple takes of the sequence and accidentally mixed up footage from before and after the glass was actually broken. This type of mistake was much more common in the era before digital filmmaking, when editors had to work with physical film strips and couldn't easily check for these kinds of inconsistencies frame by frame. Fact 13. The movie spawned a failed comic strip. Riding high on the success of his breakthrough film, Ernest Tidyman decided to explore every possible way to expand the John Shaft brand into different forms of media, including one venture that seemed like a natural fit but ultimately went nowhere. In June of 1972, Tidyman commissioned Don Rico, a veteran artist who was famous for his work on Marvel superhero comics like Captain America, to create a sample portfolio that would showcase Shaft's potential as a daily newspaper comic strip. Tidyman's vision was to bring the tough, street-smart private detective to the funny pages of major newspapers across the country, capitalizing on the character's popularity and reaching an entirely new audience that might not have seen the movie or read the books. Comic strips were still a major part of American popular culture in the early 1970s, with millions of people reading the newspaper comics every morning, so the idea seemed like it had real commercial potential. Rico took on the challenge and created 24 sample daily strips that were designed to demonstrate how Shaft's adventures could work in the condensed, episodic format that newspaper comics required. The veteran artist brought his considerable skills and experience to the project, drawing up test panels that captured both the visual style and the attitude that had made the character so appealing to audiences in other formats. Despite Rico's professional artwork and Tidyman's enthusiasm for the project, the comic strip idea never found a home in the marketplace. Tidyman shopped the sample strips around to leading newspapers in both New York and Los Angeles, but none of the publishers showed enough interest to pick up the feature for regular publication. The failure of this venture represented one of the few times that Tidyman was unable to successfully translate his most famous creation into a new medium, leaving the comic strip as an interesting footnote in Shaft's multimedia history. Fact 14. Tidyman killed off Shaft out of frustration. By 1975, Ernest Tidyman had grown increasingly frustrated with the direction his most famous creation was taking, leading him to make one of the most shocking decisions in mystery fiction history. After writing 6 successful Shaft novels that had made him wealthy and famous, Tidyman decided that the only way to end the series properly was to literally kill off John Shaft in the most brutal and unexpected way possible. The problem wasn't that Tidyman had lost interest in writing, or that the books weren't selling well. It was that he felt the quality of his work was declining, because he was juggling too many different projects and characters at the same time. Tidyman was a perfectionist who prided himself on being a skilled craftsman with a great ear for dialogue, and he became increasingly concerned that he wasn't giving Shaft the attention and care that the character deserved. To help him keep up with the demanding publishing schedule, Tidyman had started using ghostwriters to help produce the later Shaft books, but this collaboration only made him more worried about the series losing its authentic voice and distinctive style. He felt that the character was becoming a shadow of what he had originally created, and he didn't want to continue publishing books that didn't meet his own high standards. In The Last Shaft, published in 1975, Tidyman shocked readers by having his tough, seemingly invincible private detective get randomly murdered by a common street mugger in the final paragraph of the book. Shaft's last words in the series were, "What is this bullshit?" as he died from his wounds, bringing an abrupt and decidedly unglamorous end to a character who had survived countless dangerous adventures with organized crime figures and international conspiracies. Tidyman's widow later explained that her husband chose to kill Shaft because he felt it was better to end the series than to let the quality continue to slip. Fact 15. Richard Roundtree survived male breast cancer. In 1993, Richard Roundtree faced a health crisis that was both personally devastating and completely unexpected, forcing the tough action hero to confront a disease that most people wrongly assume only affects women. At the age of 51, Roundtree was diagnosed with breast cancer, a condition that catches many men off guard because they don't realize that men can develop this type of cancer just as women can. The diagnosis required Roundtree to undergo a double mastectomy, a serious surgical procedure that removed both of his breasts to prevent the cancer from spreading to other parts of his body. This was an incredibly difficult experience for someone who had built his career on projecting strength and masculinity, but Roundtree approached his illness with the same determination and courage that had made him such an effective action star on screen. Rather than hiding his condition or treating it as something to be ashamed of, Roundtree made the brave decision to speak publicly about his experience and use his celebrity status to educate other men about the reality of male breast cancer. He became an outspoken advocate for greater awareness of the disease, emphasizing that breast cancer is not gender-specific and that men need to take their health seriously instead of maintaining what he called a cavalier attitude about health issues. 4 years after his treatment, Roundtree reflected on the positive response he had received for speaking out about his cancer, telling reporters that he had gotten such encouraging feedback because so few men were willing to discuss this type of health problem openly. He proudly identified himself as a survivor and continued his advocacy work for many years, helping to break down the stigma and misconceptions that prevent men from seeking proper medical care.